The words hit like a slap. We got married yesterday. Still, I didn't react, just stared at her, my son's new wife, as the phone trembled in my hand. As the faint hum of the city echoed through the silence, I felt the betrayal settle deep in my chest. While my mind raced, I noticed the rain tapping against the window, soft, relentless. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the wedding. This was about losing everything, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not yet. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Michael Turner's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, the screen glowing in the soft gray light of the Portland morning. The rain outside had begun to fall steadily, a quiet rhythm tapping against the windows, blending with the stillness of the room. He glanced out toward the misty skyline, the same view he'd had for years, the same city that had been home to him and his family, even as things slowly started to slip away. His son, Daniel, had been distant lately, and Michael had noticed it. A few months back, Daniel had mentioned something about a wedding, but the details had been sparse. Michael wasn't the type to ask too many questions, but lately, a gnawing uncertainty had settled deep in his chest. Something about the way Daniel spoke, the hesitancy in his voice, didn't sit right. The phone rang 3 times before Daniel picked up. "Hey, Dad," Daniel's voice came through, tinny and distracted. Michael could hear the faint background noise, Lily's laugh, sharp and almost condescending, cutting through the moment. "Hey, Daniel," Michael replied, trying to mask the weight in his voice. "I heard a rumor. Something about a wedding date? You got one yet?" For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then Daniel's voice came back, a little more strained than usual. We're still planning it, Dad. You know how it is. Just figuring things out." Michael's brow furrowed as he listened. He could tell Daniel was avoiding the subject. The laugh in the background, that sharp, mocking sound, didn't help. He stayed quiet for a beat, gathering his thoughts, letting the weight of the moment sit with him. The rain on the windows grew heavier, as though the world was echoing his unease. "I see," Michael said, his voice steady. He wasn't sure if Daniel even heard the undercurrent of hurt behind his words. "Well, let me know when you're ready to book flights. I'd like to be there, when it happens." Another long pause. Michael could almost hear Daniel's mind racing, trying to come up with a response that wouldn't push too hard, wouldn't reveal too much. Michael had raised him. He knew his son well. He could sense the distance, the avoidance in the air, but he said nothing more. Finally, Daniel muttered, "Yeah, sure, Dad. I'll, keep you posted. Talk soon." The call ended abruptly, leaving Michael holding the phone in his hand, staring at the empty screen. His grip tightened around it, though he didn't register the tension in his fingers. He'd hoped for something more, an openness, a connection, but he got nothing. The rain outside continued to fall, the steady drizzle adding to the melancholic weight hanging over him. Michael stared out the window, his mind working through the silence that now settled between him and Daniel. He had no answers, no clarity, just a growing feeling that something wasn't right. He put the phone down and typed a quick message. "Let me know when to book flights." He hit send, then stared at the screen for a moment longer. The words felt hollow. The finality of them hung there, unanswered. Seconds stretched into minutes, then hours. No reply. Michael sat back, his thoughts swirling, but his face remained calm, a mask of controlled patience. Outside, the sky darkened, the rain falling harder now, as if the world shared in his quiet grief. The storm had started, but the true fury of it, that was yet to come. The morning light crept through the blinds, casting a pale glow over Michael Turner's kitchen. The storm had passed, but the dampness still clung to the air, and the weight of the rain lingered in his bones. He sat at the table, the silence of the house wrapping around him like a blanket he couldn't shake off. His hands were steady, yet there was an undeniable tightness in his chest as he sipped the coffee he'd made for himself, quietly, methodically. It had been a routine for years now, but today, something felt different. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him, the faint vibration against the wood making him pause. He looked down, expecting to see a text from Daniel, maybe an apology for not responding the night before. Instead, it was a message from Lily, Daniel's wife. His thumb hesitated before unlocking the screen. "We got married yesterday," the text read, the words on the screen searing into him, colder than any storm could have been. Michael's breath caught in his throat as his heart sank. He blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the reality was clear. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mistake. It was the truth, blunt and final, a truth he wasn't ready to face. The phone vibrated again, and his eyes flicked down. Private ceremony, only important people. The words stung. His grip on the phone tightened, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. He simply sat there, frozen in the moment, the weight of betrayal settling into his bones like the damp air from outside. The image of Daniel, his son, the boy he had raised on his own, the boy he had protected and guided, faded in his mind, replaced by the cold reality that Daniel had chosen something else. Chosen someone else. Michael's eyes went distant as he set the phone down gently on the table, as though it might shatter if he handled it any differently. His gaze drifted to the window, but the view wasn't the one that mattered now. His mind flooded with memories of long nights spent talking, of school plays and graduations, of all the small moments when he'd been everything Daniel had needed. Had it all meant so little? He leaned back in his chair, hands still on the table, and the memories washed over him, vivid and sharp. He'd been a father for years, a single father, always doing his best. But now it felt like he'd been erased. He wasn't just excluded from this wedding. He had been forgotten, replaced by a family that didn't care, a wife who'd never bothered to see him as anything more than an obstacle. The anger bubbled up inside him, but he pushed it down, kept it contained, like he always did. He wouldn't let them see him weak, not yet. Not until he knew what he was going to do. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood slowly, almost mechanically, and went to answer it. Sarah, his daughter, was standing in the doorway, her face flushed with anger. Without a word, she pushed past him into the kitchen, her eyes already on the phone on the table. Michael didn't need to say anything. Sarah had known the moment she saw the text. She had heard the coldness in Lily's words too. "This is ridiculous," Sarah spat, her voice trembling with rage. "He's your son, Dad. How could they do this?" Michael didn't answer right away. He just stood there, leaning against the counter, staring down at the phone. His fingers clenched around the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "He chose to forget me," he whispered, so quietly that Sarah almost didn't hear him. His voice wasn't filled with anger, not yet, but with something deeper. Grief, betrayal, the slow realization that the years of sacrifice, the love he'd poured into his son, hadn't been enough. It hadn't mattered. Sarah's face softened, her fury replaced by the same sorrow that had begun to consume Michael. She stepped toward him, placing a hand on his arm. "Dad, we'll figure this out. You can't just—" But Michael shook his head. "There's nothing to figure out. He's made his choice." The words hit like a slap. His heart twisted as he realized how true they were. Daniel had made his choice, and it wasn't him. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. The truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Michael wasn't sure if it was the hurt or the shock that kept him frozen, but he felt it settling into the pit of his stomach. A decision had been made, and now there was nothing left but the slow, agonizing fallout. As the tension in the room thickened, Michael's gaze drifted once more to the window, the rain now coming down in sheets, a reflection of the storm inside him. But the storm wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Sarah sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly, the muffled hum of the city outside, filtering through the window. Michael had stepped out to get some fresh air, or perhaps he just needed to be alone. He hadn't said. She didn't blame him. After what had happened, what they'd found out, it felt like everything had been shattered in an instant. Daniel, her younger brother, had crossed a line. But this was something else. The notification came in quietly at first, a soft ping, too quiet for her to ignore. It was a post from Lily's mother. She hesitated for a moment, knowing full well what it could mean. She wasn't prepared to see her brother's wedding, not like this, not without him there. But she opened it anyway, her finger hovering over the screen as her heart began to race. The photos were everywhere, beautifully staged, perfectly lit, the kind of images you'd expect from a high-end magazine spread. Lily stood at the center of it all, her porcelain skin glowing under the soft glow of chandeliers, her smile radiant, almost forced. But what hit Sarah first wasn't Lily's face, it was Daniel's. He looked like he'd stepped out of a dream, smiling wide, standing beside his in-laws. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made Sarah's breath catch. Daniel looked happy, too happy. And he wasn't standing with Michael. He wasn't standing with his own family. The absence of their father, the man who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything to give Daniel a life, a future, it was glaring. It was a hole that couldn't be ignored, a wound that cut deeper than anything Sarah could have imagined. The comments beneath the photos flooded in, a sea of congratulatory messages, people fawning over the beautiful couple and the perfect ceremony. But not a single person mentioned Michael, not a single word acknowledging the fact that Daniel's father wasn't even there to witness the day his son made a decision that would change everything. The screen blurred in front of Sarah's eyes, her vision clouded, and before she knew it, tears began to fall. She wiped them away quickly, but it didn't stop them from coming. She hated herself for letting them fall, but it was impossible to stop. She felt like she was suffocating, like the walls were closing in around her. How could Daniel do this? How could he go through with something so important, so life-altering, and not even think to invite their father? The man who had been everything to him, who had given him everything. Her phone buzzed again, another comment. Sarah clicked it open, not sure why, but as she read it, the sting only grew sharper. Such a beautiful day. So happy for you both. She swallowed hard. The people around Daniel, his new family, had known. Everyone knew about the wedding. Everyone knew except for Michael. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. A part of Sarah wanted to scream, to call Daniel and demand an explanation. But then she remembered that Michael hadn't screamed. He hadn't lost his composure when he read the message from Lily. He'd just gone quiet, too quiet, the calm before the storm. She tossed the phone down beside her, burying her face in her hands. The tears flowed freely now, even though she knew it wouldn't help, even though she knew Daniel wouldn't feel a thing. She heard the sound of the door opening softly behind her, and didn't need to look up to know it was Michael. His footsteps were steady, measured, like he was walking through a fog. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his presence filling the space between them. Finally, Sarah wiped her eyes and stood up, turning to face him. "I don't understand, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How could he do this to you? How could he not even tell you?" Her chest tightened, and her voice cracked as she spoke, the hurt slipping through. Michael looked at her, his eyes calm, almost empty, as though he had already processed everything she was feeling, but without the same outburst of emotion. His face was composed, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper than hurt, something that had been simmering beneath the surface since the phone call, something that hadn't been fully released yet. "He didn't lose me today," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He lost himself." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Sarah felt the weight of them pressed down on her, the enormity of what they meant. It wasn't just about a wedding. It wasn't just about Daniel's betrayal. It was about something far bigger. A choice had been made, and the ripples of that choice were going to echo for a long time. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? What could anyone say? The damage was done, and the silence that filled the room felt suffocating. Michael turned away then, slowly, his shoulders stiff, but not with anger. Something quieter, something colder. He walked toward the window where the soft drizzle had started again, the rain tapping gently against the glass. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, and Sarah realized something then. He wasn't just grieving what had been taken from him. He was preparing for something else, Something that was coming, something that neither of them was ready for. The storm had only just begun. Michael stood at the doorstep, his hand gripping the brass handle, the tension in his chest unbearable. The invitation had come weeks ago, a polite gesture, or maybe an attempt to smooth things over. Daniel had phrased it as a family dinner, but Michael had no illusions about what this meeting really was. There was no apology in the air, no reconciliation. It was a formality, a way for them to pretend like everything was fine, as if the wedding, his son's wedding, hadn't been a slap in the face. As if the man who had spent decades raising Daniel was supposed to quietly accept the betrayal. He stepped inside, his shoes making a soft click on the polished hardwood floor. The room smelled of roast meat and expensive perfume, the kind of dinner party atmosphere Michael had never quite understood. It was all a little too clean, too staged. He could already feel the unease gnawing at him. Lily stood near the dining room table, her arms crossed, her expression almost detached as she looked up at him. She didn't offer a smile, didn't acknowledge his presence with anything more than a cool, calculated glance. Behind her, Paul and Marlene Carter stood talking, their voices low, but the sharpness in their tone made it clear they were already sizing him up, already dismissing him before he even had a chance to say a word. Daniel was there too, standing awkwardly by the window, his back to Michael. He hadn't turned around to greet him, hadn't even looked in his direction. His posture was stiff, like he was trying to brace himself for something he knew was coming. Michael felt a sudden rush of anger, but he held it back, kept it locked inside. Anger wouldn't help him here. Not yet. "Dad," Daniel said, finally turning around to face him. His voice was thin, forced. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. There was no apology in his eyes, just that same emptiness that had been growing between them for months now. Michael's stomach churned at the sight. "Good to see you," Michael replied quietly, his voice betraying none of the emotion swirling beneath the surface. He looked at Daniel for a moment, but the hurt was too much to hide. It burned in his chest, aching with every word unspoken. Still, he kept his voice steady. "Well," Paul Carter said from the other side of the room, a slight smirk on his face, his voice smooth. "It was a family event, you know. Just us, keeping it small, intimate. Nothing personal, just practical." His tone was casual, but the edge in his words was clear. He was asserting dominance, reminding Michael of his place. Michael's jaw tightened, the anger simmering just beneath his calm facade. "So I wasn't invited," he said, his voice colder now, the mask slipping slightly. "It was too intimate for a father." Paul didn't flinch. "We didn't want distractions," Lily chimed in, her voice clipped, almost dismissive, her eyes never quite meeting his. "We thought it was better this way, less drama." The words hit like a slap. Michael swallowed hard, holding back a surge of emotion. His heart raced, but his face remained unreadable. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, thick and suffocating, as though everyone was waiting for something to break. Michael's eyes flicked to Daniel, but his son wouldn't look at him, not even now. Before Michael could speak again, Sarah stormed in from the hallway. She had been quiet up until now, but her face was red with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't going to stand by and let this go on without saying something. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. "He raised Daniel alone. For years, he did everything. And you—" She turned to Lily and Paul, her eyes blazing. "You think you can just erase that? You think you can pretend like he wasn't there? Like none of it matters?" Her voice was louder now, shaking with the raw emotion that Michael had been holding in, that he had kept so carefully contained for months. This was her brother. This was their family, and it was being ripped apart. Lily opened her mouth to say something, but Sarah wasn't done. "You think this was some small thing? That it's just about the wedding? No, it's about respect, about loyalty, about family. And he was there, every step of the way." Michael felt the anger bubble up again, but before he could stop her, he stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. "Let's go," he said, his voice low but firm. It was the only thing he could think to say, the only thing that would keep things from escalating further. He could feel Sarah's tension, her desire to keep fighting, but he knew it was pointless now. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line as she glared at the Carters, but she nodded and followed Michael toward the door. Neither of them said anything more as they made their way out of the house. The weight of everything hung heavily between them. As they reached the door, Michael heard a whisper behind him, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. "It's better this way." Marlene Carter's voice slid out from the shadows of the living room, as cold as the rain outside. "You'll see. It's for the best." The words hung in the air, lingering long after they'd left the house. Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to, but something inside him twisted. Something deep, something he couldn't ignore. The storm had only just begun, and it was far from over. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the soft light of the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had been staring at the same pile of unopened mail for the better part of an hour, each envelope a small, unimportant part of his day. It was routine, nothing extraordinary, until one envelope caught his eye. It was an official-looking envelope from the bank, addressed to Daniel, but with Michael's home address written on the front in the same familiar handwriting he had seen for years. He paused, his hand hovering over the letter, a strange feeling crawling up his spine. His mind raced as he opened the envelope, the thin paper slipping between his fingers. Inside, he found a loan application, an application with Daniel's name at the top, but something was off. He stared at the form, trying to make sense of it. The numbers, the fine print. It all seemed typical at first glance, but then his eyes froze on the signature line. It wasn't Daniel's signature. It was his. Michael's own name, sloppily forged, a crude imitation of his handwriting. His stomach churned as he ran his finger over the ink, the weight of the betrayal settling deep inside him. His son had forged his signature to get a loan, using Michael's home address as a security measure. His own flesh and blood had used him as collateral, without his knowledge, without his consent. The anger didn't hit him at first. Instead, it was a deep, suffocating sadness that spread through him, weighing his heart down with every second that passed. How had it come to this? How had his own son, the boy he'd raised alone, chosen this path? The confusion in Michael's mind twisted like a knife, and the silence of the room pressed in on him. He wanted to shout, to throw the paper across the room, but instead he folded it carefully and set it down on the table. Just then, Sarah entered the room, her face drawn tight with concern. She'd heard the change in his breathing, the shift in his posture. Michael didn't have to say a word. She could tell something was wrong. She walked over to the table, her eyes falling immediately on the loan documents. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with a familiar tension. Michael didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. Sarah knew him too well. She reached for the papers, her fingers brushing over the forged signature, and her face hardened instantly. "Daniel," she murmured, as if saying his name aloud made it more real. "He actually did this." Michael sat back, his gaze still fixed on the documents. The shock was starting to wear off, replaced now by a quiet determination. "He did," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "And he thought I wouldn't find out. He thought this would stay hidden." Sarah looked up from the papers, her brow furrowed. "What are you going to do?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as though the weight of the moment demanded careful consideration. "I need to see Ben." The drive to attorney Ben Kovach's office was a blur. Michael's thoughts raced, but he kept his eyes on the road, each mile putting more distance between him and the house that had once been a home. The house where his son had grown up, where he had learned to walk, to talk, to become the man he was now, who, it seemed, was capable of this betrayal. Ben's office was small, neat, and meticulously organized. He had known Ben for years, had trusted him with everything, from minor legal matters to more serious issues. Ben had always been the kind of person who handled things with a cool, calculated precision. But as Michael walked into the office, he felt something shift. The weight of what he was carrying, the anger and the hurt, was growing heavier with every step. Ben looked up as Michael entered, his usual calm demeanor barely masking the concern in his eyes. Without a word, Michael handed him the documents. Ben glanced at them quickly, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. His fingers paused at the forged signature, and then he looked up at Michael, his face hardening with understanding. "This isn't a mistake," Ben said, his voice low but firm. "This is planned. Someone wanted this to happen." Michael felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He had known, on some level, that this wasn't a simple error. There was too much at stake here, too much being hidden. "How bad is it?" Michael asked, his voice strained. Ben leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he considered the situation. "If this goes public, it's more than just a forgery charge. It's fraud. They've involved you in a scheme, Michael. And your son? He's in deep." The words hit harder than any blow. Michael's mind raced, images of Daniel, of everything they had shared, flashing through his mind like broken pieces of a puzzle. He couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it. But the truth was right there, laid out in front of him. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the documents in Ben's hands. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms. "Then they planned with the wrong man," he said, his voice low but resolute. Ben looked at him carefully, his eyes searching Michael's face, gauging the decision that was starting to take shape. Michael didn't flinch. He knew what had to be done. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the loan. It was about the lie, the betrayal, and he wasn't going to let it stand. The storm had broken, and Michael was going to make sure it wasn't just the Carters who were swept up in it. The dim light in Ben Kovac's office flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the polished wooden table between them. Michael sat across from him, his hands clenched into fists, though he wasn't sure if it was the anger or the grief tightening his grip. It had been days since he'd seen the forged documents, the betrayal still fresh in his mind, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Ben sat calmly, flipping through the pages Michael had handed him. The sharp sound of the paper turning seemed too loud in the otherwise quiet room. Michael's mind was racing. He needed answers, but everything was starting to feel like one long blur of disappointment and confusion. Ben paused, his eyes flicking up from the documents to meet Michael's gaze. "The Carters are playing a dangerous game," Ben said quietly, his voice steady but grim. "They want your property, Daniel's new business. They need it, and they need your signature to secure a loan." Michael's chest tightened at the words. He had suspected something, but hearing it aloud felt like a punch to the gut. His mind flashed to the image of Daniel standing in that picture-perfect wedding, a smile plastered on his face, as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't just betrayed the man who had given him everything. "They married fast," Ben continued, his voice low, careful, "to legitimize the deal. They needed a clean way to get everything they wanted, without drawing attention. That wedding wasn't about love, Michael. It was about business." The words cut deeper than Michael expected. He had always known the Carters were a little cold, a little calculating, but he had never imagined Daniel would become a part of that world. He had always been so different, so his son, the boy who had helped him fix HVAC units, who had learned to work with his hands and loved it. He'd never once thought Daniel would trade that for a life built on lies. Michael swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "So, this was the plan all along? Use me? Use my property?" Ben nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. "That's what they needed, Michael. Your property is the anchor, the only thing they didn't have. But with that loan, they could start fresh, build something. And with Daniel in the center, they thought they could make it work. They figured you'd be none the wiser." Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers still pressing against the table, the reality of it all sinking in. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief. He could feel it building inside him, an avalanche of emotions he was struggling to keep contained. But now, there was a deeper sense of betrayal that cut through it all. Not only had Daniel forged his signature, but he'd done it for something that wasn't even real. A false life, a hollow existence, built on manipulation and lies. "I should have seen it coming," Michael said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "It was too clean, too perfect. They knew what they were doing." Ben's expression softened for a moment. Michael, it's not your fault. You trusted him. You did the right thing by helping him, by raising him. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But now we need to think strategically, and what you need to do next is not what you might want to do. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly beside Michael, her eyes flicking from one person to the other, finally spoke. What do we do, Ben? Her voice was low, but there was a strength in it, a need for action. Michael could feel her impatience, her desire to fix this, to make it right. She had always been the fighter between them, the one who didn't let things slide. Ben leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as he spoke. We let them think they won. Michael blinked, confused. What? Ben's eyes were steady, his gaze never wavering. Let them build the rope, he said quietly, as if he had said it 100 times before. They've already made the move. They've set things in motion. If we go after them now, we'll just create a mess, one that they can fight back on. But if we let them play their game, they'll hang themselves with it. The fraud will come to light, and when it does, you'll be the one in control. Michael sat in stunned silence. Let them think they won? It wasn't what he had expected. He had wanted to tear everything apart, expose the lie right away, confront Daniel, confront the Carters. But Ben was right. If he acted in haste, they would only turn it against him. He had to be patient. Let them dig their own hole. Let them get comfortable with their victory. And then, when it all came crashing down, it would be too late for them to turn back. Michael let out a long, slow breath. He could feel the anger still burning inside him, but it was tempered now by the determination to play the long game. Let them build the rope, he repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the words. They've made their move. Now, I'll make mine. Ben gave a small nod of approval. Exactly. We'll wait for the right time, and when it comes, you'll have the leverage you need to destroy everything they've built. The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension thick between them. Michael wasn't sure if he felt any relief or if he was just too numb to process the plan. But as he stood up to leave, the weight of what was coming hit him. The storm wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. And when it hit, it would destroy everything. But it would be his storm. The phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter, breaking the silence that had settled in Michael's home since the confrontation with the Carters. He had been waiting for the call, the apology, the something that might fix this, even if he knew it was too late. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a moment. It wasn't an incoming call. It was a text from Daniel. Let's meet. We should fix things. Michael's thumb hovered over the screen, uncertainty flitting through him for just a moment. He could feel his pulse quicken, the weight of what he had to do hanging heavily on his shoulders. It would be so easy to lash out, to let his anger take over, but that wouldn't help. No, now wasn't the time. Not yet. He typed back quickly, keeping his response measured, controlled. All right, let me know when and where. He put the phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape of Portland through the kitchen window. There was no relief in sight, just the steady, relentless downpour. It mirrored his thoughts, clouded, heavy, a storm that was still far from over. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. It was Daniel, a quick message. How about brunch tomorrow at Lily's parents' place? I'll explain everything, I promise. Michael didn't hesitate. He typed a simple, neutral response. I'll be there. When Michael arrived at the Carters' house the next morning, the tension was thick in the air, and yet the facade was perfect. The house was pristine, the front lawn neatly manicured, every corner of the house giving off the impression of immaculate order, a life built on appearances. The Carters had clearly gone out of their way to make him feel welcome. A fresh pot of coffee brewing, breakfast laid out elegantly on the table. But underneath it all, Michael could see the cracks in the perfect image. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was happening here. Lily greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was polite enough to pass for friendly. Glad you could make it, Michael, she said, her voice smooth, a little too smooth. She gestured toward the table. We've got plenty to discuss. Let's sit down. Shall we? Michael nodded, following her into the dining room where Daniel was already seated, his posture stiff, almost nervous. He had never seen his son like this, awkward, uncomfortable in his own skin. Daniel looked up, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, their eyes met. There was no warmth in his gaze, only something distant, almost apologetic. But Michael didn't trust it. He wasn't here for forgiveness. Not yet. Paul Carter walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his presence imposing as always. He flashed Michael a tight smile, the kind that barely concealed the undercurrent of superiority. "We're glad you could join us," Paul said, his tone more patronizing than genuine. "I'm sure we can sort all this out over some good food, right?" Michael didn't respond immediately. He took a seat at the table, the fine china gleaming in front of him, and noticed how the others were watching him carefully, waiting. His eyes flicked to the documents stacked neatly by the coffee cups, loan agreements, refinance paperwork. He recognized the type, and he knew exactly what they were. This was all part of the plan, wasn't it? Make nice, pretend it's all behind them, and get him to sign away his rights, his property. Lily pushed a plate toward him, and for a moment, Michael considered the surrealness of the situation. They were acting like everything was fine, like they hadn't just played him for a fool. As he reached for a slice of toast, he kept his face neutral, his posture relaxed. His mind was already on the next move. "Here's the thing, Michael," Lily said, her voice sweet, almost patronizing. "We just need you to sign a few things. Just formalities, really. You know how it goes. We'll handle the rest." The smile on her face widened, but Michael could see it, barely concealed behind the veneer of politeness. She was confident. Too confident. He nodded slowly, keeping his face as impassive as he could manage. "Of course, I'll sign whatever you need. It's the least I can do." Daniel's shoulders relaxed at his words, his face lighting up with relief. Michael could almost hear the silent sigh of relief escape him. He had expected resistance, expected a confrontation, but Michael wasn't giving them that satisfaction. Not yet. The Carters, all of them, were blind to what was about to happen. Paul spoke again, his voice thick with arrogance. "It's a new chapter, Michael. We're just tying up some loose ends, a little paperwork, and then we can all move forward. No hard feelings, right?" Michael's heart burned with anger, but he held it in, letting the words hang in the air between them. He smiled, a thin, controlled smile. No hard feelings. Lily leaned back, her smug satisfaction almost palpable, thinking she had won. But Michael knew better. He knew exactly what they were after, and he knew what he had to do. As they handed him the papers, his fingers brushed over them, feeling the weight of the signatures they expected from him. He glanced at Daniel once more, but this time, he wasn't looking for any apology. This was about strategy now. Michael had a plan, and it wasn't about getting angry. It wasn't about confronting Daniel. It was about letting them think they had won, while he prepared to take everything from them. With a quiet, deliberate motion, Michael signed the papers, but his mind was already racing ahead, his next move already set in motion. As he stood to leave, the false warmth of the moment suffocating him, he turned to Daniel. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice cold, not a trace of warmth in it. They watched him leave, none the wiser. But Michael knew. The game was far from over. It was just beginning. The Carters' home was nothing short of opulent. The high ceilings, the polished marble floors, and the gleaming silverware on the table all screamed wealth. Everything was perfectly curated. The kind of home where appearances mattered more than anything else, where a perfect family could be staged for the world. Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of it, this cold, calculated display. It was everything that had driven a wedge between him and his son. He sat at the long, gleaming table, his hands folded in front of him, and tried to keep his thoughts in check. He wasn't here for any of this. Not the surface-level politeness, not the extravagant breakfast, not the smile that Lily shot him from across the table. He was here for one thing, the truth. Daniel had invited him, of course. He looked as uncomfortable as Michael felt, shifting in his seat, unable to look him in the eye for more than a few seconds at a time. Lily was at the head of the table, effortlessly moving between her parents and Michael, trying to create an atmosphere of ease. But Michael wasn't fooled. "I'm glad you could join us, Michael," Lily said, her voice sweet, Yet there was something off about it, something rehearsed. "We've got everything ready, just a quick little formality, and we can all move forward." The words were wrapped in sugar, but Michael could see through them. He wasn't here for brunch. This was a business meeting, and they were playing their part. They wanted him to sign the documents, to sign away everything, without asking too many questions, without disrupting their perfect plan. Lily slid a set of papers across the table, her fingers moving delicately as she pushed them in his direction. "It's just some refinancing stuff," she said, the practiced smile never leaving her face. "You're keeping the house, Michael. Nothing to worry about." Michael picked up the papers slowly, pretending to read the first few lines. He could feel his pulse quicken as he flipped through them. Everything looked normal at first. Terms, conditions, all standard, except for one thing. He flipped back through the pages and saw the forged signatures, his own signature, duplicated with a crude inaccuracy that made his stomach churn. It was like a gut punch. The words blurred on the page, but the fraud was clear. They had been doing this for longer than he thought. This wasn't just a matter of money. This was a deliberate attempt to get him to sign without realizing the extent of what they had done. They had forged his signature on prior drafts, and now they were presenting him with the final version, assuming he wouldn't notice. The realization hit him harder than he expected, and for a brief second, his anger threatened to break through his calm exterior. But he suppressed it. He couldn't act out, not yet, not in front of them. This was his move, his strategy. Lily, smiling, seemed completely unaware of the storm that was brewing inside him. She was convinced that this was all a formality. She pushed the papers a little closer, her fingers barely grazing the edge. "It's all in order, really. We just need your signature to finalize everything." Michael's fingers hovered over the page, his eyes scanning the document slowly. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, the expectation that he would sign away everything without question. But Michael wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not yet. He signed the document, his hand steady, but his mind working 1,000 miles a minute. The truth was, he knew what was really going on. He knew they wanted him to fall into their trap, to sign away his rights so they could use his property to secure their loan, their future, their perfect life. But they didn't realize one crucial thing. He wasn't signing their document. He was signing the controlled copy, one that Ben had already vetted, one that would lead them straight into their own downfall. They thought they had him, but they had no idea what was coming. Michael handed the papers back to Lily with the same measured calm, his face a mask of politeness. "There you go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've signed everything." Lily beamed, a look of smug satisfaction crossing her face. "Thank you, Michael," she said, as though she had just pulled off the perfect con. "This really helps us move forward." Daniel, who had been quiet up until this point, suddenly stood and walked over to Michael. He looked at him for a moment, his expression softening, before pulling him into a hug. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice laced with relief. "I knew you'd come through." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Michael stood frozen. His son was thanking him, as if he had just done something noble, something good. But Michael knew the truth. Daniel wasn't grateful. He wasn't remorseful. He was just relieved the con was still intact. He pulled away from the hug slowly, keeping his emotions hidden beneath the surface. He nodded at Daniel, but the smile he gave him was thin, forced. He wasn't about to play the part of the forgiving father just yet. There was too much at stake, too much they had taken from him already. As he stood to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had signed their papers, but they had no idea what was coming next. They had just admitted their intent to defraud him, and Michael wasn't going to let them get away with it. He walked out of the Carter's house with a heavy heart, but a clearer mind. The trap had been set, and he had played his part perfectly. But now, it was time for the reckoning. The atmosphere in the lender's office was sterile, too clean, too clinical, like the finality of a deal being sealed. Daniel sat across from the loan officer, his palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning. He was trying to act confident, to hold his ground, but inside, everything was falling apart. He had no idea what was really happening, just that the paperwork had been signed, and it was only a matter of time before the deal went through. The loan officer scanned the documents, his eyes moving quickly across the pages. There was a pause, too long for comfort, and then the officer looked up at Daniel, confusion etched on his face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner," the officer said, his voice hesitating. "There seems to be an issue. These documents, they're conflicting. There's a discrepancy in the signatures. One version has Michael Turner's signature, but on another draft, it's not quite right. The officer paused, his eyes darting back to the paper. "It looks forged." Daniel's heart dropped, his throat tightening. His hands trembled, but he tried to hide it. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. How could this happen? He hadn't thought this through, didn't realize the trap he'd been walking into, but it wasn't just him who was going to pay the price. It was everyone. "Mr. Turner," the officer said again, "I'm going to have to consult with legal before I proceed." A few minutes later, Daniel's phone buzzed, and the name that flashed on the screen was one that made his heart race, Ben Kovacs. He answered quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ben, what's going on?" he asked, his voice almost frantic. Ben's voice came through the phone with a sharp edge. "Daniel, they've caught the discrepancy. It's only a matter of time before this all unravels. I've already spoken to the lender, and I've filed an emergency injunction. The transfer is blocked for now." There was a long pause on the other end before Ben continued, his tone low. "This is a mess." Daniel's mind spun, the gravity of what was happening settling in like a lead weight. The deal that had seemed so simple, so straightforward, was now a house of cards crumbling in front of him. His own father, his own flesh and blood, had been used as the pawn in this game, and now it was all falling apart. "Ben, what do I do now?" Daniel's voice cracked with desperation. Ben's response was clear, his voice cutting through the panic. "There's nothing you can do right now. We need to let this play out. Don't make any moves. If you do, it will only make things worse." Daniel hung up, the weight of Ben's words hanging in the air. He slumped in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him, feeling like he was suffocating. At the same time, Michael and Sarah were in their living room, watching everything unfold from the sidelines. They had made a silent pact. They would stay quiet for now, wait for the right moment. Michael had instructed Sarah to hold back, to not speak publicly about what was happening. It was too soon. They needed time. The world didn't need to know the truth yet, but even in their silence, there was an undercurrent of tension. Michael had never been good at hiding his emotions, but he'd learned to mask them over the years. The storm inside him was brewing, but it wasn't ready to break. Not yet. Sarah, on the other hand, paced the floor, her mind racing with questions and fury. She wanted to lash out, to tell everyone what was really going on, but she kept her mouth shut. It wasn't her time yet, either. Meanwhile, across town, the Carters were moving forward as if nothing had happened. At a dinner party that night, they couldn't stop talking about how they had taken charge of the situation. Paul and Marlene sat in their usual spots, smiling smugly as they regaled their guests with the news that everything was falling into place, just as they had planned. "Daniel's business is going to skyrocket once the paperwork goes through," Paul said with an air of superiority, raising his glass. "We've secured everything we needed. We took care of the last details, and now it's just a matter of time. This was a big move for the family." He looked around the room as if awaiting applause, the smugness in his eyes impossible to miss. Marlene chimed in, adding her own 2 cents. "Everything's moving so smoothly now. I'm sure Michael will come around once he sees the bigger picture. It's all for the best, after all." They laughed, the sound cloying and false, but they didn't see it. The truth, the storm that was brewing just beneath their perfect veneer, wasn't something they could recognize yet. But Michael knew. Michael sat back in his chair, watching the Carters from a distance, hearing their boasts on the phone from the other room, and he couldn't help but smile to himself. They were so sure of their victory, so confident that they had gotten away with everything. But they hadn't. Not yet. The storm was coming, and when it hit, everything they thought they had built would come crashing down. But Michael wasn't ready to make his move just yet, not when they were still so blind. Let them celebrate. Let them think they had won. The truth would come when it was least expected, and when it did, it would be too late for them to turn back. It was a quiet morning when the news broke. Michael's phone buzzed once, then twice, and then a third time, the screen lighting up with a message from Ben Kovacs. Michael's fingers hesitated over the screen before he opened it, the dread already settling in his stomach. The message was short but clear. The loan has been flagged. Fraud suspicion. Michael felt his breath catch in his chest. It wasn't a surprise. He had known it was only a matter of time. But seeing it written down in black and white still hit him like a punch to the gut. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the gray Portland sky. The storm he had been preparing for was finally here. At the Carter's house, the mood was anything but calm. The phone call from the bank had already come through, and Daniel was pacing in the living room, his face pale, his hands running through his hair in agitation. Lily was on the phone, speaking rapidly, trying to smooth things over with the bank, but it was clear the situation was spiraling out of control. "How did this happen?" Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice shaking with frustration. "How could they flag the loan now?" Lily, her eyes sharp with barely contained anger, slammed the phone down and turned toward him. "I told you not to get your father involved," she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This is his doing. You should have known better than to trust him." Daniel's heart raced, and for a brief moment, he wondered if his father had sabotaged it all. But then, the thought recoiled within him like an instinct he couldn't shake off. He looked up at Lily, his voice quiet but firm. "He wouldn't do that." Lily's eyes narrowed as she crossed the room toward him. "He did this on purpose, Daniel. He's been working against us from the start. He's jealous." Daniel's throat went dry as the words hit him. He shook his head, but deep down, a small part of him wondered if there was any truth in her words. His father had always been protective. Sometimes it felt like too much. Michael had never been the type to let Daniel spread his wings, to let him chase the future he wanted. But sabotage, that was a stretch. Still, doubt lingered. The door to the dining room opened with a heavy creak, and Paul Carter walked in, his face red with anger, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His words came out like a bitter hiss. "This is his fault," Paul spat, glaring at Daniel. "Your father's jealousy has ruined everything. He's holding you back, keeping you small." Daniel froze. Paul's words hit him harder than anything Lily had said, the weight of them sinking into him. His father, Michael, had always been there for him, hadn't he? They'd had their moments, sure, but there had always been love in that house, even if it had been quiet, sometimes hard to see. He wasn't sure anymore, not with the pressure building on all sides. Lily stepped forward, her voice dripping with contempt. "I knew it was too good to be true," she said, her hands clenched into fists. "This was supposed to be our chance to move up. But your father, he can't stand the idea of you being better than him." Daniel's stomach churned. He wanted to defend Michael, wanted to shout at his mother and stepfather that they were wrong, but the doubt kept eating at him. Was there something he had missed? A reason why his father hadn't been as enthusiastic about his success as everyone else had been? He wasn't sure anymore. And before he could process the swirling emotions, Lily's voice escalated, her fury uncontained. "Your father sabotaged everything, and now we're stuck, Daniel. Stuck." The air in the room crackled with tension. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt sick, the weight of the accusation heavier than anything he'd ever felt. The people he was supposed to trust, the ones who should have been his allies, were turning on him, blaming Michael for their failure, as if the man who had raised him had done this to hurt him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel didn't know what to say. His throat closed up, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe, the thought of the life he'd tried to build slipping away from him. Back at his own house, Michael had been sitting in the silence for hours. Sarah had been quiet too, as they waited for the storm to come. But Michael had been preparing. He had known it wouldn't be long before the Carters turned on him, blamed him for what was happening. He had watched the games they played, listened to their empty words and false assurances, and now it was time to act. He was done with waiting. The plan was in motion. He would give them the space to dig their own hole deeper, let them keep spinning the narrative that they were the victims, but the final blow was coming. It was just a matter of when. As he stared at the phone in front of him, his finger hovering over the screen, a single thought ran through his mind. This was it. The last move. He hit send. The Carters had no idea what was coming. And as Michael put the phone down, he smiled to himself, the weight of the decision settling into him like a heavy, satisfying truth. The cracks had already begun to show, but soon they'd break wide open, and Michael was ready to watch it all fall apart. The day the evidence arrived, it was like a bomb went off. Michael didn't hear the first few pings of the email. He was sitting on his porch, staring at the rain as it fell in steady sheets, his mind focused on everything that was coming. But when he finally opened the message from Ben Kovacs, his stomach clenched. The email was brief, the subject line simple. Here it is. Beneath it, a single attachment. A link. Michael clicked it, his fingers steady despite the tremor inside. As he waited for the file to load, his mind raced. He'd known it was coming, the moment when the Carters would have to answer for what they'd done, but seeing it all laid out before him was different. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. This was proof. The first file that opened was a PDF. It was a collection of documents, the forged signatures, the same sloppy replicas of his own name, the ones Daniel had used to secure the loan without Michael's consent. The second page contained a recording, a hidden audio file from the brunch at the Carters' house. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the voice of Lily, then Daniel, and then Paul filled the room. He listened, and each word cut through him, like glass, scraping at his skin. It was all there, Lily's voice, too smooth, too controlled as she spoke about how they'd just needed Michael's signature, and how Daniel had been the one to push for the fast wedding to make it all happen. Michael's heart pounded as he heard it, the truth finally exposed. No more guessing, no more assumptions. The timestamps showed everything. It was all there, the date of the wedding, the forged documents that had been finalized before Michael even knew what was going on. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as the legal language hit him. It wasn't just fraud. It was deliberate, strategic, and now it was indisputable. The packet that Ben had prepared was a weapon, and it was pointed directly at the Carters. The world was about to see them for who they really were. At the Carters' home, the first sign that something was wrong came when Lily's phone buzzed. Her face went pale as she read the email that had just arrived. Daniel, who had been sitting across from her, leaned forward, sensing the change in her demeanor. Lily's hands trembled as she tapped the screen, opening the email with the same quiet tension that had been building between them for weeks. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his voice flat, almost afraid to hear the answer. Lily's voice was a low whisper. "It's from Ben, the lawyer." She scrolled through the document, her eyes darting quickly over the words, her face slowly draining of color. "This could ruin us." Daniel's pulse quickened as he moved closer, his heart thudding in his chest. He read over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he recognized the familiar handwriting on the forged documents. His own signature, his own handwriting, was there, unmistakable. It was an eerie feeling, seeing his own actions laid out in front of him like this. He had signed those documents. He had been part of it. But he hadn't realized, couldn't have known, how deep the lies had gone. His breath caught as he felt the full weight of it. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice trembling now. The guilt in his chest was overwhelming. How had it gone this far? How had he not seen what was happening? Lily stood up suddenly, her face tight with panic. "This is it, Daniel. This is the end." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the realization hitting her with full force. "We can't fix this. We've been caught." Paul entered the room, his expression dark, his jaw clenched. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Lily turned to him, her eyes filled with fear. "It's Michael. He's done this. He's sent this evidence. He's exposing us." Daniel looked between them, his hands clenched tightly. "We can't blame Dad for this. This was our mistake. But his words faltered as Paul cut him off, his voice icy and unforgiving. "Your father is jealous, Daniel. That's the truth. He never wanted you to succeed, and now he's using this to destroy us." Daniel's mind spun, the anger and confusion mixing together in a whirlwind. His father had never wanted this for him. But this wasn't Michael's doing. Not really. It was his own decision to go down this path, to trust Lily and the Carters in the first place. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he'd been manipulated, just like the rest of it. Had he been used as a pawn in their game? He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Michael's number. His throat tightened as he listened to the rings, the silence pressing in on him. He needed his father now more than ever. He needed to explain. But the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. No answer. His frustration built, the confusion and guilt threatening to overwhelm him. His father had always been there. Always. Why wasn't he answering now? Michael sat at his desk, his phone on silent, staring at the wall in front of him. He had been expecting the call. He knew it would come. But when it didn't, when Daniel's voice never filled the silence, Michael's heart hardened. The game had begun. And now there was no turning back. The evidence had been sent. The truth was in the open. But there was still one thing left to do. One final step. And Michael wasn't about to wait any longer. The news broke like wildfire. A whisper, a rumor at first, soon escalated into headlines. Michael hadn't been prepared for it to spread this fast, hadn't thought it would reach the business community so quickly, but it did. The fraud attempt, the forged signatures. It all came to light in the blink of an eye, and the damage was swift and severe. Michael sat at his kitchen table, watching the news feed on his phone, his hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. The business world he had spent his life building, his connections, his reputation. It was all crumbling around him, and for the first time, he realized the magnitude of what was happening. The text alerts were relentless, and the first few were easy to ignore. But then, the calls started coming, loud, sharp, accusatory. Investors who had been circling Daniel's business project pulled their offers. One by one, the promises vanished. Emails flooded in, each one more damning than the last. Daniel's name was now synonymous with fraud, his reputation in tatters before it had even begun. The messages from Lily's parents came next. First, the phone calls, then the texts, laced with anger, with blame. "You should have known better. This is your fault, Daniel." And then the silence that followed was even louder, empty, judgmental. The Carters had lost face. The pristine image they had built over the years, the very foundation of their lives, was now in shambles. Michael's phone buzzed once more, but this time it wasn't a text or an email. It was Sarah. He answered on the first ring, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Dad, we need to talk," Sarah said, her tone gentle, but with an edge of concern. Michael didn't respond right away. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. But he knew what she was going to say. He knew what she was thinking. "You didn't destroy him," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence. "He did." The words stung, but they were true. Michael had been reluctant, hesitant to believe that his son, his flesh and blood, could make such a mess of things. But he had, and now there was no going back. The truth was out, and no amount of denial could change it. "I didn't want this," Michael said quietly, his voice a whisper, almost to himself. He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the gray sky. The rain had stopped, but the heaviness remained. But sometimes truth needs a microphone. It needs to be heard. Sarah let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again, her voice filled with the kind of understanding only she could provide. "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier." Michael didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. His mind drifted back to the phone call he'd gotten earlier, the one from Ben Kovacs, when the full weight of what Daniel had done had first settled in. The fraud, the forgery, the lies. And now, Daniel was paying the price. Across town, Daniel was pacing through his living room, phone in hand, his head spinning with a mixture of disbelief and dread. His phone buzzed again, another message, another call from Lily. When he picked up, her voice was ice cold. "What the hell happened, Daniel? You've ruined everything. Everything." I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Daniel said, his voice shaky, barely above a whisper. The guilt, the regret, all of it was suffocating him. I was just trying to make something of myself. I didn't know. Lily's voice cut him off, harsh and unforgiving. You didn't know? You think that's going to make this go away? You've ruined my life, Daniel, our life. Do you understand that? We were this close to everything we wanted, and you blew it. Daniel stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear, unable to respond. Her words sank into him like 1,000 needles, and he could feel his world unraveling. Lily's accusations felt like a slap, and every word dug deeper into the hole that had already begun to swallow him. Lily didn't give him time to respond. You've destroyed everything, and I can't be part of this anymore. The line went silent as she hung up. Daniel's chest tightened, and for a moment, the room felt like it was closing in around him. He stood there, the phone in his hand, the weight of the world crashing down on him. The Carter's world was falling apart, and he was the one who had set it in motion. Michael sat in silence as Sarah moved around the kitchen, trying to distract herself with little tasks that didn't matter. The quiet was oppressive now. The storm wasn't over, but it was no longer outside. It was inside. Michael knew what was coming: the divorce, the anger, the blame. But there was nothing he could do to stop it now. It had all spiraled too far. He had done what needed to be done. But it didn't change the fact that his family was fractured, broken, and as he watched the rain start again, the rhythm soft and relentless against the window, he knew the worst was yet to come. The knock on the door came suddenly, sharp, almost frantic. Michael had been sitting in his favorite chair by the window, the dull light of the late afternoon fading into the shadows of the room. He didn't need to ask who it was. He already knew. He stood slowly, his body aching with the weight of everything that had happened, and walked toward the door. The rain had started to fall again, steady and cold, as if the world itself couldn't help but mirror the tension that had been building for weeks. When he opened the door, there stood Daniel, disheveled, eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling at his sides. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at Michael with a mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion. A broken man who had nowhere else to go. The anger Michael had felt over the past few days had dulled into something else now, something quieter, more painful. This wasn't a victory. It was the wreckage of a life he had tried so hard to protect. Come in, Michael said softly, his voice distant, almost mechanical. He stepped aside to let Daniel enter, but he couldn't shake the tightness in his chest. They hadn't spoken in days, but Michael had known this moment would come. It had to. Daniel walked into the living room, his eyes not meeting Michael's. He moved like a man on the edge of breaking, his shoulders hunched, as though he were trying to make himself smaller, less visible. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, as if the weight of everything that had happened hung between them like a wall they couldn't climb over. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. I messed up, he said, the words heavy and regretful. I was greedy, I was stupid, I thought I could fix things. I didn't know how bad it would get. His breath hitched, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to break down, but he held himself together. Just barely. Michael's gaze softened, but there was something else there too. Something that wasn't so easily erased. You didn't know? Michael asked, his voice low, the hurt seeping through despite his attempts to keep it hidden. You didn't know? You lied to me, Daniel. You used me, and you didn't think I'd find out? Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out the weight of Michael's words. I didn't mean to, he said again, his voice smaller now, quieter. I was just trying to be better. I wanted them to see me, to finally be something they could be proud of. The confession hung in the air, but it didn't bring any relief. Michael felt the sting of it deep in his chest, but he didn't let it show. So, you thought betraying your family was the way to get there? You thought taking what's mine would make you better? Daniel's shoulders slumped, his eyes filling with tears. I wanted their approval, he said, his voice cracking. I wanted to be someone they'd finally respect. But I don't know. Maybe I just wanted to prove that I could do it without you, that I didn't need to rely on you anymore. His voice broke completely as he spoke, and the tears that had been threatening to fall finally spilled over. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Michael stood still, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His heart ached at the sight of Daniel, his son, on the verge of breaking. But the bitterness that had built up over the past few weeks was still there, lingering in the pit of his stomach. "At the cost of your family?" Michael's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "At the cost of us? How could you think that was worth it, Daniel? What kind of man are you becoming?" Daniel sobbed, his shoulders shaking, and he took a step closer to Michael, as if seeking something, anything, that might bring them back to what they once had. "I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear, but it felt like if I didn't do this, I'd be stuck, like I'd never get out of your shadow." His voice cracked again, the weight of everything he had done finally crashing down on him. "Can I fix this, Dad? Please, tell me how." The question hung in the air, but Michael didn't answer right away. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him, for the first time in days. His son was broken, no longer the man he thought he could be, the man who had made his own choices, but was now facing the consequences of those choices. And Michael realized something in that moment. There wasn't a quick fix, there wasn't an easy way out of this, but there was a path forward. "You can start by listening," Michael said, his voice quieter now, but the weight of his words still heavy. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way he had been. But there was something in his voice, a raw honesty that Daniel had never heard from him before. "You've got a long way to go, Daniel, but it starts with listening to what's right, what's real. You've been running from it for too long." Daniel looked at him, his face still streaked with tears, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes, just a glimmer. "I'll listen. I will. I swear." But Michael knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There was a long way to go before they could even think about fixing what had been broken. For now, though, Michael just turned away, his heart still heavy with everything unsaid between them. The storm wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. The papers arrived early that morning, a simple envelope, but its contents were anything but. Daniel opened the letter with trembling hands, the weight of the words sinking in with every second that passed. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the final acknowledgement of everything that had been shattered, a verdict that felt as cold as the world outside. Lily had filed for separation. The words on the page were sharp, almost clinical. "I married into a mess," Lily had written, her signature at the bottom as though it were just another transaction, a clean break from a life she had never wanted in the first place. The finality of it hit Daniel like a physical blow. He hadn't wanted this, never wanted this, but he had brought it all upon himself. The lies, the betrayal, the desperation to prove himself, everything had led to this moment. He had lost her, lost everything. He stared at the letter for a long time, the ink blurring with his own tears, the space where his future should have been, now an empty void. It wasn't just Lily. It was his entire life that had fallen apart. His business, his family, the dream he'd fought so hard to build, everything was unraveling, and it was all his fault. In the meantime, Michael sat in his kitchen, his face set in quiet resolve, staring out the window at the rain-soaked world outside. Sarah had left earlier in the day, giving him space, and for the first time in days, he found himself truly alone with his thoughts. The betrayal, the lies, it all seemed like a distant memory now, and yet the weight of it still pressed on him, harder than ever. He hadn't heard from Daniel since the night of the confrontation. He knew his son was out there somewhere, trying to figure things out, but Michael wasn't ready to make any moves. Not yet. Not until the full truth came to light. The stakes had been raised, and there was no going back now. The phone rang, cutting through the silence. It was Daniel. Michael's hand hovered over the phone for a moment, the familiar ache of uncertainty gnawing at him. He knew what the call would be. Another apology, another desperate attempt to fix everything, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. Not yet. He answered. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Daniel's voice cracked, fragile, distant. "I've messed everything up. I don't know where else to turn. I need help, but not money. I need you to listen." Michael's breath caught. He could hear the rawness in Daniel's voice, the desperation that had been building for weeks. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just listened to the silence on the other end of the line, and then he spoke, his voice measured, but quiet. "Where do you want to meet?" Daniel hesitated, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "There's a diner on 5th Street. I'll be there in an hour." Michael didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, though Daniel couldn't see him. "I'll be there." The diner was small and quiet, the kind of place where the clatter of coffee cups and the soft hum of conversation made everything feel distant and unreal. The fluorescent lights flickered above as Michael stepped inside, his boots clicking softly on the tile floor. He saw Daniel sitting in a booth near the back, his shoulders hunched, his head down, as if he were trying to shrink away from everything he had done. Michael walked over slowly, sitting across from him. The moment was heavy with unspoken tension. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from the sleepless nights, the weight of everything pressing on him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The air between them was thick with the truth. Too much to say, too little to undo. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to get this bad. I thought I could make it all work. I thought I could fix everything." Michael's gaze was steady, unflinching. "You can't fix everything, Daniel. Not overnight. Trust doesn't come back that easily. You've broken it, and now you have to live with that." Daniel swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a slap. "I'll do anything to make it right. Anything." His hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I'll sign over everything. All of it. Any claim I have left to your property, your business. Just let me fix this, please." Michael took a long, measured breath, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. He had expected this, expected the desperation, but he wasn't going to make it easy. Not this time. Daniel pushed the paper across the table, his hand trembling. Michael didn't take it right away. He stared at the document, the same one that had brought them all to this point. Daniel had no idea how much it meant to Michael now, how much it signified. The gesture was there, but the damage ran deeper than any signature ever could. Michael's hand finally moved, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he folded the paper in half, slipping it quietly into his jacket pocket. No words were exchanged, no promises made. Daniel watched, the weight of his actions settling in the space between them. "You can start," Michael said finally, his voice a low rumble, "by listening. To yourself. To the people you've hurt." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with regret, but his mind racing with everything that was still unsaid between them. Michael stood up, his movements slow, purposeful. He didn't look back as he walked out of the diner, but as he stepped into the rain-soaked street, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel sat there, alone in the booth, the sound of the storm outside, matching the turmoil inside him. He had given up everything. Everything. And for what? To fix a broken life that was beyond repair? As he stared at the empty diner booth, the weight of the truth came crashing down, and for the first time, he realized that redemption wasn't something that could be bought. It had to be earned, and he had no idea how to begin. The courtroom was a cold, sterile place, the kind of room where decisions that could alter the course of lives were made in hushed tones, behind closed doors, far from the chaos outside. Michael sat at the back of the room, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his mind sharp, but his face calm. He had been through this before, never in this context, never with his own family, but he knew the routine. He knew how this played out. Still, the weight of the situation hung heavy over him. Daniel sat beside him, his posture stiff, his face pale with anxiety. This was the culmination of everything, every decision, every lie, every moment that had led them to this. There was no going back now. His future hung in the balance, and the guilt, the remorse, were gnawing at him. He hadn't meant for it to go this far, but now, in the quiet tension of the courtroom, it was all real, and it was all his fault. Ben Kovacs, their attorney, stood at the front of the room, his presence methodical and calm. He had been through hundreds of cases, each one more complex than the last, but this one had become personal for him. Michael could see it in his eyes. Ben was doing everything he could to ensure the outcome wasn't just a victory. It was a redemption, a chance to make things right for Daniel. He moved with purpose, presenting the evidence methodically, each document laid out with precision. The forged signatures, the timestamps, the emails from Lily and the Carters, all pointing to deliberate actions meant to defraud. The Carters, sitting at the other side of the room, were a picture of defiance. Paul leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Marlene, sitting beside him, wore a tight smile, her eyes narrowed, calculating. They didn't look nervous. No, they looked confident, almost arrogant, as though the law didn't apply to them. But the truth, as it often does, was a force that could not be ignored. Ben presented the evidence clearly, succinctly, his voice unwavering as he outlined the steps the Carters had taken to deceive Michael and Daniel. The forged signatures, the rushed wedding, timed perfectly to lock in the loan. Each piece of the puzzle was laid out, and Michael could see the Carters' confidence start to waver. The walls were closing in. It wasn't long before the Carters attempted to shift the blame. Paul stood up, his voice booming in the courtroom, attempting to paint Daniel as the mastermind behind it all. "My son-in-law was manipulated," he claimed, his voice dripping with indignation. "He was coerced into signing papers by Michael Turner. This whole thing is a setup. Daniel didn't know what he was doing. He was misled. Michael has been working against us from the beginning." Daniel flinched at the accusation, the weight of Paul's words crushing him. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but Michael placed a steadying hand on his arm. There was nothing more to say. The evidence spoke for itself. They didn't need more lies. They needed truth. The judge, an older man with graying hair and a stern expression, listened to the Carters' defense without emotion. He turned to Ben, who had already anticipated this move, and prepared his counter-arguments. With methodical precision, Ben pointed out the holes in the Carters' narrative, showing the evidence that clearly implicated them in the fraud. He didn't waste time. He didn't need to. The Carters had no choice but to sit back, their attempts to shift blame falling on deaf ears. When the verdict was finally delivered, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge spoke with a calm authority, his voice unwavering. The actions taken by the Carters were deliberate and deceptive. Fraudulent documents were submitted with intent to deceive, and while Mr. Turner did not press charges, the attempt to defraud his family and the bank is undeniable. Michael's jaw tightened as he listened. The judge turned to Paul and Marlene, his words heavy. "You are both hereby fined for your role in this fraud." Michael barely registered the Carters' reaction, their faces hardening, their pride clearly wounded. They had expected to walk out of this unscathed, but the reality of their actions had caught up with them. Paul muttered something under his breath, clearly angry, but Michael didn't care. This wasn't about them anymore. The judge then turned to Daniel, who had been sitting in silence the entire time. "Mr. Turner, you have been involved in this scheme, but your actions were not as deliberate. You were manipulated by those you trusted. I am hereby issuing a reprimand. You will not face jail time, but consider this a second chance." Daniel nodded, relief flooding his face, but the guilt still clung to him like a heavy fog. He didn't deserve a second chance. Not really. As the court adjourned, the room emptied out slowly. The Carters gathered their things, their pride shattered, but their arrogance still intact. Michael didn't watch them leave. He couldn't. He stood, ready to leave, when Daniel approached him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was just a son, broken, standing in front of his father. His eyes were red, but there was something else there, something Michael hadn't seen in him for years. Gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say, but thank you." Michael didn't answer right away. He just looked at him. He had spent so long carrying the anger, the betrayal, the grief. But now, standing here, there was nothing left but quiet understanding. "You can start by being here," Michael said, his voice softer now. "Start by earning back the trust you lost. But don't think for a second that this is over. Not yet. Daniel nodded, and for the first time, Michael saw something different in his son's eyes. Not relief, not even guilt. Just the beginning of a long road back. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Michael felt the weight of everything still lingering in the air. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, they were at the eye of it. And in that quiet moment, with Daniel beside him, Michael realized that this was the first step toward healing. But the next move, that would come soon enough. The room was dim, the soft hum of the house barely cutting through the silence. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the papers in front of him spread out with a quiet finality. The pen rested in his hand, steady but heavy. He knew what this meant. He'd known for days now, but now that the moment had arrived, there was a part of him that still hesitated. The property, the house, the land, the life he had built. It had always been a symbol of stability, of family, of everything that had been right in his life. But now, it was something else. A lifeline, a tool for redemption. It wasn't about the money anymore. It never had been. It was about showing his children, especially Daniel, that there was more to life than fast success and empty promises. There was something deeper, something that had to be earned. Michael glanced at the door. Sarah had already given him the nod. She understood what he was doing. She had always understood. But there was no getting around the weight of this decision. He signed the first page, then the next, and the next, his fingers moving with precision, but with an underlying sorrow. The trust was set up in Sarah's name, along with provisions for his future grandchildren, but not for Daniel. Not yet. The weight of that decision was heavier than anything he had done in the past week, but it was necessary. It was the only way he could be sure that Daniel would truly understand the consequences of his actions. The house was no longer just a family home. It had become a boundary, a lesson, a reminder. Daniel stood in the hallway, his back to the wall, listening to the sound of the pen scratching across paper. He knew what was happening. He had known since Michael had first brought up the idea of the trust. But hearing it, the finality of it, hit him harder than he had expected. The air in the house felt thicker now, heavier, as if the walls were closing in around him. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this small, this insignificant. The last few months had been a blur. His attempts to rebuild his life after everything had fallen apart, his efforts to earn back Michael's trust. The job he'd taken at the local hardware store, a modest, humbling position that required him to scrape by with honesty and hard work. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be something he wasn't. He was just trying to make amends, one step at a time. But now, standing in the hallway, he realized the truth of what his father was doing. Michael was offering him a second chance, yes, but it wasn't going to be easy. The path ahead was long, and there were no shortcuts. Daniel's mind raced, torn between guilt and understanding. He stepped forward into the kitchen, his voice unsteady. "I understand," he said, his words carrying the weight of everything he had come to realize in the last few weeks. "I don't deserve it yet." Michael didn't look up right away. He finished the last line, set the pen down, and leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady but weary. He had made his decision. "You will," Michael said quietly, his voice low but sure. "But you have to build yourself first. I'm not going to give you what you haven't earned." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just the quiet resolve of a man who had spent years trying to protect his family from their own mistakes. "The road ahead won't be easy, Daniel, but I believe you can get there, if you put in the work." Daniel nodded, the sting of those words hitting him harder than anything else. The road wasn't just long, it was filled with consequences, with rebuilding trust and showing his father, his sister, and everyone else that he had truly changed, that he had learned something, something that had eluded him for too long. The weeks that followed were quieter than Daniel had expected. His job at the hardware store became his world. Each day he woke up at dawn, worked long hours, and went home exhausted. But there was something comforting in the routine, something that kept him grounded. He had always been so consumed with ambition, with trying to prove himself to everyone around him. But now, he found peace in the simplicity of hard work. Michael checked in every so often, brief phone calls, quick texts, but nothing more than that. He didn't offer guidance anymore. He didn't need to. Daniel was learning. Slowly. Quietly. It wasn't a straight path. There were moments when doubt crept in, when Daniel wondered if it was all worth it. But then he would catch a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror and remind himself why he was doing this. He wasn't doing it for anyone else. Not for Lily, not for his parents. He was doing it for himself. He had to prove to himself that he could be better. One evening, as Daniel was heading home from work, he found Michael waiting for him on the porch. His father's presence was steady as always, but there was something different in his eyes this time. A subtle warmth, a quiet approval that spoke volumes. Daniel stopped in front of him, unsure of what to say. "Hey," Michael said, his voice rough around the edges. "How's it going?" Daniel looked down for a moment, then up at his father, his voice steady. "I'm getting there." Michael nodded, his gaze softening. "Good. Keep going." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after years of tension, after everything that had been broken and couldn't be undone. But in that moment, standing together on the porch, Michael felt a shift. There was no anger left in him, no judgment, just the quiet acceptance of a father who had done what he needed to do and now had to wait. The road ahead for both of them was still uncertain, still long, but for the first time in a long while, Michael felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. But the question lingered in the air, unspoken. Was Daniel ready to walk it? The answer wasn't clear yet, but Michael knew that, for now, that was enough. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon, its contents unmistakable from the moment Daniel saw it. A thick letter with Lily's name scrawled across the front. Her handwriting that once carried the weight of affection now felt more like a heavy hand pushing him away. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the tension in his chest tighten with every passing second. He knew what it was before he even opened it. Lily had filed for divorce. She'd finally put it in writing, made it official. "I married the wrong Turner." The words in the letter cut through him like a blade, and for a moment, it was as if everything inside him just stopped. The house felt empty, even though he was standing in it. The life he had fought for, this image of success, of moving up, of building something with Lily, was gone. He couldn't even bring himself to feel the anger. All he felt was numb. He thought about all of the moments they had shared, the plans, the laughter, the hopes. They seemed so distant now, like something he had imagined, not lived. How had it come to this? How had the person he had trusted with everything, his love, his future, turned away from him so completely? It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of the image he had created, the dream he had worked so hard to build, now reduced to rubble. And as the reality of it all settled in, Daniel knew there was no going back. His future, once so bright with promises, was now full of shadows, and he was left standing alone. That evening, as the darkness crept in, Daniel packed a few things and headed to his father's house. Michael hadn't called, hadn't offered a place to stay, but Daniel knew he couldn't stay where he was any longer. The walls felt suffocating, the silence unbearable. When he showed up at the door, Michael didn't say anything at first. He just let him in, wordlessly. Daniel didn't know what to expect when he entered, but there was no harsh judgment in his father's eyes. No, I told you so. Just quiet understanding, as if Michael knew, deep down, that this was the only place Daniel could go now. It wasn't a return to comfort, but more of an unspoken agreement between them. He would stay here until he figured things out. The first few days were awkward. They didn't talk much, just the occasional exchange about groceries, or the weather, or whatever mundane thing Michael had to say. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. Just two people, living together in the aftermath of a storm, trying to find some semblance of peace in the quiet. Dinner that night was simple, just a plate of pasta and bread. The silence between them stretched on, until Daniel finally broke it, his voice low but steady. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Dad," he said, the words heavy with regret. "Not after everything I've done." Michael didn't look up from his plate immediately. He took a long pause, his hand resting on the table as he considered Daniel's words. It wasn't the first time Daniel had said something like this, but this time there was something different in his voice, a weariness, a real sorrow that Michael hadn't heard before. "You don't," Michael replied quietly, his voice calm but firm. "But that doesn't mean you can't earn it." Daniel's chest tightened at the words. He had always known, deep down, that forgiveness wasn't something that could be given freely. It had to be earned. But hearing it from Michael, hearing the calm certainty in his voice, it was a reminder that this wasn't about grand gestures or empty apologies. This was about action, real, tangible change. And it scared him, because deep down, he knew that earning his father's forgiveness was the hardest thing he would ever have to do. For the first time, Daniel wasn't looking for an easy way out. He wasn't hoping for some magic moment where everything would be fixed in a day. No, this was the slow, painful road to redemption. And Michael was right. He had to earn it. The days passed slowly, each one a small step forward. Daniel took up a job at a local shop, a modest position that didn't pay much but gave him something to focus on. The work was hard but honest, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the constant pressure of trying to impress anyone. There was no glamour, no promises of quick success, just the simple satisfaction of earning his keep, of doing something real, something that mattered. Michael checked in on him occasionally, a simple call or a quiet word in the evening. But there were no lectures, no pushing, just a father watching, waiting, as his son began to rebuild himself. The moments between them were small, but they were enough. There were no grand speeches, no forgiveness handed down with ease. Just time, and the quiet understanding that both of them had things to work through. Winter arrived quietly, the cold seeping into the house with each passing day. The first snow fell softly, blanketing everything in a thin layer of white. It was symbolic in its way, a fresh start, a cleansing of sorts. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the world that seemed so still, so quiet. For the first time, he felt like he could breathe. Michael stood beside him, both of them watching the snow fall in silence. It was a small moment, but it carried more weight than either of them realized. They had come through something, a storm of their own, and now there was a kind of peace settling over them. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't done, but it was a start. Daniel turned to his father, the words coming slowly, like he was still learning how to speak them. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." Michael didn't say anything at first, but he placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, heavy, comforting. "We'll get there," he said, his voice soft, "one step at a time." And as they stood there together, in the quiet of the falling snow, the path ahead seemed just a little clearer, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The road to redemption had only just begun. The morning light was soft, the clouds still heavy above Portland, but the sun was trying to break through. The streets glistened with remnants of last night's rain, the air crisp and fresh as Michael, Daniel, and Sarah made their way to the cafe. The familiar hum of the city was there, but everything felt different today. For the first time in what felt like years, they were walking together, not just in proximity, but as a family, a real family, not the fractured version they had been for so long. The cafe was quiet when they walked in, a cozy little place on the corner where they had spent mornings together before everything fell apart. Michael had picked it, a quiet gesture of wanting to return to something familiar, something untouched by the mess of the past few months. The place hadn't changed. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and the sound of soft conversation filled the space. But this time, as they sat down at the table, it was different. They were finally facing each other fully, without the weight of guilt or unspoken words between them. Daniel sat across from Sarah, his eyes downcast, as if unsure of how to begin. He hadn't seen her much since everything happened, the rift between them, the tension that had hung in the air. But today, it was just the three of them, no one else. He couldn't help but feel the weight of everything he'd put her through, the betrayal she'd witnessed, and how much damage he had caused. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Sarah, I'm sorry. For everything. Daniel said, his words sincere but still uncertain. For lying to you, for not being there, for just messing everything up. He looked up at her, his eyes full of regret and an openness he hadn't shown before. You didn't deserve any of that. I'm sorry. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt like a wall. It was the silence before something shifted, before the possibility of healing. Finally, Sarah nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. You were messed up, Daniel. We all were. But we're here now. That's what matters. Her voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength in it. I forgive you. But I need time, too. We all do. Michael watched them quietly, his heart heavy. But lighter than it had been in a long time. There was a weight lifted, just by seeing his children share the same air without the invisible divide that had once kept them apart. The anger, the betrayal, all of it had worn him down. But now, in this moment, he saw something different in both of them. There was a future here, even if it wasn't clear yet, even if it wasn't perfect. He caught Daniel's eye and, for a brief moment, saw something that had been missing for so long. Sincerity. Real sincerity. Not the empty promises of the past, but something tangible, something Daniel was offering, in a way that felt like it came from the core of who he was. It wasn't enough yet, but it was the beginning. We'll get there, Michael said quietly, his voice thick but steady. He wasn't sure how long it would take, how many more hard conversations would come, but he was willing to take those steps, one at a time, and this moment, this was the first step. Sarah leaned over and hugged Michael, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. He felt her warmth, the comfort of knowing that even in the hardest moments, they could still find a way back to each other. You held us together, Dad, she whispered. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. The past few months had felt like an endless storm, but there were rays of light cutting through. Not everything was fixed, not everything was healed, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. Broken things can be rebuilt, Michael said quietly, his voice thick but resolute. It takes time, but it can be done. He looked out the window, the clouds parting slowly to reveal the sun breaking through, a soft golden light casting over the street outside. It felt like a sign, like the world was offering them something. Hope, maybe, or at least a glimmer of it. As they sat there together, the world outside beginning to soften with the sunlight, Michael realized the path ahead was still uncertain. There would be more moments of doubt, more moments of pain, but there was a chance now, a real one, and maybe, just maybe, they would all find their way back to something better, something stronger. But as the sun broke through the clouds, so did the quiet understanding between them. The storm wasn't over, but it was passing, and in the quiet space between them, there was hope. But would it last? Would they be able to keep going forward together? The question hung in the air as they sat in silence, unsure, but willing to try. The office was modest, nothing flashy, just a small corner of Michael's home, with a desk, a few filing cabinets, and a single simple whiteboard detailing the small but steady stream of work they had ahead of them. Daniel sat across from his father, both of them looking at the plans they had outlined together. There was no grandeur to their vision, no get-rich-quick schemes or empty promises. It was grounded, honest, and ethical, a business based on the work Michael had been doing for decades, now with Daniel at his side. Michael slid the new business card across the table. It was simple, blue letters on a white background with the name of their new HVAC partnership. The logo was understated, just a clean line drawing of a tool in a house, but it felt real. It felt like something they could be proud of. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a spark of hope that he hadn't realized he'd lost. We start small, Daniel, Michael said, his voice steady, no hint of the anger or bitterness that had clouded their relationship for so long. We build slow and steady. No shortcuts, no flash, just hard work and good service. That's how we make it last. Daniel nodded, his hands still trembling slightly, though not from fear anymore. There was something else in his chest now, something lighter, but more determined. The weight of the past was still there, but it was a different kind of burden now. It was the weight of starting over, of rebuilding. This wasn't the flashy new venture Daniel had dreamed of in his more naive days, but it was real, and it was his. The first few weeks were difficult. The work came in slowly, but the small projects piled up. They worked out of the modest office, doing everything from basic repairs to more complicated installations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and every client that called was another opportunity to prove to himself and to Michael that he could do this. Daniel worked long hours alongside his father, learning the trade, gaining respect, and earning every bit of it. Then one afternoon, a call came in from a local restaurant that needed their HVAC system serviced. It was a small job, nothing major, but it was a start. When they arrived on site, the manager was friendly, appreciative, and, once the work was finished, gave them a glowing review. "You know," the manager said, wiping his hands on a rag and giving Daniel a thoughtful look, "your father raised you right. You did good work today." Daniel froze, the words hitting him harder than he expected. It wasn't about the job. It wasn't about the money they made that day. It was the recognition, real, tangible, and earned. The kind of compliment he had never expected to hear again after everything he'd put his family through. For a moment, his throat tightened, and he had to swallow the lump that had formed there. He looked away quickly, trying to hide the tear that threatened to escape, but it was too late. Michael noticed. He had been watching Daniel more closely than he'd let on, seeing the shift in him over the past few weeks. The young man who had once been so full of himself, so desperate to prove his worth, was finally becoming someone else. Someone better, someone real. "Let's go," Michael said softly, his voice steady but warm. They walked out of the building together, the air crisp and fresh, and for the first time, Michael felt a sense of pride, not in the work they had done, but in the man Daniel was becoming. As they reached the truck, Michael clapped Daniel on the shoulder. The action was simple, almost casual, but the weight of it was enormous. "Legacy isn't a wedding invitation," Michael said, his voice low, but the meaning of it clear. Daniel had learned the hard way that legacy wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about doing the right thing, day after day, even when no one was watching. Daniel's throat tightened again, but he didn't speak. Instead, he nodded, his face flushed with both shame and gratitude. He had never truly understood the weight of what Michael had tried to teach him until now. The road wasn't over, far from it, but it was a road he could walk, with his head held higher, with dignity. Slowly, steadily, he was rebuilding the trust he had broken. "Thanks, Dad," Daniel whispered, barely audible. Michael didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The moment was enough. They had both known, without saying it aloud, that this was a turning point, a quiet one, but significant. They were on their way to something better, something that would take time, but would last. A legacy that wasn't about flashy weddings or quick fixes, but about building something real with sweat and integrity. As winter set in, bringing a crisp chill to the mornings, the business began to grow. Slowly, but surely. Michael and Daniel took on more work, and Daniel started to gain the respect of those who hired them. It wasn't flashy or quick, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel realized something. This was what it meant to be part of something that mattered, to build, not just a business, but a life. As the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Daniel sat by the window, looking out at the world outside. The snow blanketed everything, softening the harsh edges of the city, and for the first time, he felt like he was part of that quiet, steady change, not just as a man who had failed, but as someone who was finally learning how to rebuild. And though he didn't know what the future held, for the first time in a long time, he believed it was something he could face, one step at a time. A year had passed since everything began to shift, the quiet days of rebuilding, the slow but steady progress, the moments of doubt, and finally, moments of understanding. Michael sat in his car, parked outside the courthouse, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he looked at the building before him. The gray Portland sky hung low, but the air had a sharpness to it that told him the season was turning, much like the season of their lives. Daniel had invited him and Sarah here to witness something simple, a ceremony. But not just any ceremony. This was something different, something real, a vow renewal. Not at a grand hall, not surrounded by people who didn't matter, but in a courthouse. With just the family. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to impress anyone. It was, in every way, the kind of ceremony that meant something. Michael's mind flicked back to the last wedding, the one where Daniel had married Lily, where he had been excluded from the celebration. The pain of that exclusion still lingered, but now it felt distant. A wound that had healed enough to leave a scar, but one that had lost its power over him. He took a deep breath, feeling a lump form in his throat. It had taken time, so much time, and now, here he was, watching his son who had stumbled so badly, find his way back. Not through words, not through promises, but through actions, through the quiet work of rebuilding trust, of showing who he truly was. Sarah opened the car door beside him, the soft click of it pulling him back into the present. She glanced at him, then at the courthouse, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said softly. Michael nodded, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Yeah, this is it." Inside, the small courtroom was bare, with just a few seats set up. The judge had arrived, a quiet, composed man who looked at the two of them with a kind, understanding gaze. The room was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that only happens when people are there for the right reasons. And then Daniel walked in, his shoulders square, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't need to. He was dressed simply, his clothes modest, but everything about him seemed different, changed. The man who had walked into this room a year ago, with anger and arrogance, was no longer the same. This man, the one standing before his family, was someone who had worked for every ounce of respect he had earned. He smiled when he saw Michael and Sarah, his eyes meeting theirs, full of something he hadn't had before. It wasn't just relief, it was gratitude. "You came?" he said, his voice breaking just slightly. He stepped up to the front, facing them, but not just them. He faced his past, his future, and the people who mattered most. "I wanted you here," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "I want the right people in the front row, the ones who've always been there, even when I didn't deserve it, the ones who taught me what it means to be real." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at him. She had seen this shift in him before, through the long, slow steps forward, the quiet moments where Daniel had worked to show he could be the man he'd always promised to be. But today, standing here, it felt like it had all come full circle. He had found his way back. Michael, standing beside Sarah, watched his son with a quiet pride in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Daniel had come a long way, but Michael wasn't going to rush this moment. The weight of the past year, of everything they had been through, was still there, but it had softened. The anger that had once consumed him, that had been his shield, had been replaced with something gentler. The grief was still there, yes, but it no longer threatened to swallow him whole. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple, but meaningful. There were no grand speeches. There was no need for them. Daniel's words, though few, held more weight than anything else. When the judge pronounced them renewed, something small, something quiet, Michael felt a wave of emotion he wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just pride, it was something deeper, a release. The knot he had carried in his chest for so long, the one that had been tied by lies and loss, finally loosened. This wasn't just about Daniel's future, it was about healing, about understanding that no mistake was too great to be redeemed if you were willing to do the work. As the ceremony came to a close, Michael walked over to Daniel, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. There was no need for more words, just this simple touch. It was enough. They took a picture together, something small, something simple. For years there had been no pictures, no moments captured, nothing to prove that they had been a family. But this time, there was a photo that would go into the album of their lives, marking this day. the day they truly came back to each other. Daniel looked at Michael, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, humility. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Michael didn't speak right away. He looked at his son, his heart swelling, a quiet tear slipping down his cheek. The past, the pain, the struggle, it was all worth it in this one moment. "You found your way back," Michael whispered, his voice raw but steady. "I knew you would." And as they walked out of the courthouse together, the world outside seemed different. The sun, once hidden behind the clouds, finally broke through, casting its light on the city below. It felt like a beginning, slow, steady, but real. And as Michael glanced at Daniel and Sarah, he knew that no matter what came next, they had made it through the storm. But the road ahead, that was still unwritten.